Welcome to my third lesson on asteroids, and this is our first video. And we're going to look at actually creating a player weapon, specifically a laser that the player can shoot. Because it's not much asteroids if there's no asteroids to destroy or any weapon to destroy them with. So let's begin and start trying to make a laser to fire from the player. This video probably won't actually cover making the player shoot. That'll be the second one. So we left off with the player being able to move and us having functional engine particles. And so that was where we stopped. But now we need to start making a whole nother object. And at this point, we might need to start actually turning the player into a prefab. And a prefab is I guess it's kind of like a saved class that you can instantiate whenever you need to. So by turning the player into a prefab, that means we could respawn the player whenever the player is destroyed. We're going to need to do that for the laser, because the idea is if we turn the laser into a prefab, we can spawn one every time we press the space bar or the left mouse button. So let's go and do that. So under prefabs, we already have an existing folder called VFX. We can make another one. And so I'm going to click on prefabs and go to create folder, and it's going to be called player. And then there are two different ways to create a prefab. One is to actually go to the, well, maybe they changed that, to right click on player and choose the create. I think there should be prefab in this list. No, I think they may have taken that out. So I guess we'll just use the original way to do it, which is to take the object from the hierarchy and drag and drop it into that folder. So you'll see that the folder called player is highlighted. And when I do that, it says, would you like to create a new prefab or a variant of this prefab? Well, this is actually referring to right now that the player model is the prefab. That was considered a prefab when we inserted it. And so we want to break this from that original link. We want this to be a brand new prefab. So we're going to choose original prefab. If we choose prefab variant, I think if we were to modify the prefab of the model, it would cause this to change as well. So we just want an original. And in doing so, you can see that we have inside of here this like little box container thing representing the player ship and all of the settings we've done so far to it. You can edit your prefab through here, but sometimes it's kind of hard to actually see the full hierarchy of it. I mean, if you click on open prefab, you go to like basically a prefab editor where you would be editing the uninstantiated class of this prefab, so that whenever I wanted to spawn more players, I would just go into here and I could spawn as many as I want. To leave the prefab editor, just click this arrow right here next to the this hierarchy button. And we could even see that if we wanted to spawn more players, we could just start drag and dropping all the players that we would ever want into the game. Now, they don't have a solid collider, so that's why you see them all stacking up like this. If they did have a solid collider, they'd be pushing against each other. And so if we were to tweak the player ship prefab and were to go to mesh collider and switch it from is trigger to not being a trigger, then going back, that should cause all of these guys to have solid hitboxes now. Oh, they're at different heights, so they're not going to stack up. Let's drop all their Ys to 0. All right, now they're all on the same height plane. And so you can kind of see they crash into each other now because they have solid Y heights. They do get a little I don't know what they're doing with the mouse to predict where to go. But I do want to delete these prefabs. I just wanted to show that you could quickly add new copies of something by doing that. Additionally, if you were to edit the prefab of the player directly, which is what we're going to do for a lot of things, like for example, if I want to turn back on is trigger, I can click this. Now, until I tell it to update the prefab, this is a separate change for this copy of the player only. So if I go over here into the top into this overrides, you can see that basically what it means is that it's overriding the settings on the original player prefab. And if I were to check apply all, it would then take this is trigger change and change it in the prefab. If I were to hit revert all, it would load all the default settings from this prefab. And you can see that this is bolded to indicate this is a change from the original prefab. So I'm going to click apply all, and you can see that that is no longer bolded because that is now the default behavior of the player ship prefab. And so that kind of gets us an idea of how this is going to work. We're going to add more to the player ship over time, and we'll be updating the prefab like that as we do. But let's begin with making the laser. So I'm going to actually hide the player because when I'm building something, I usually like to build it at 0, 0, 0 because it's easy to get all the settings right. So I'm just going to, on the hierarchy, this little eyeball next to player ship, I'm going to click that, and that will hide the player. So the player still exists for purposes of the game, but it's just not going to show up and it's not selectable at the moment. And so let's start building our player laser. So let's go to game object, create empty. And I'm going to do this because I'm going to put all of the settings of the laser on this object, and then I'm going to, as a child, put the graphics. So it's currently called game object. I'm going to rename this to player laser. And I'm going to also start adding tags. Tags are a good way to group different things so that, like, let's say we had 3 or so different player weapons. If they were all tagged as a player weapon, we would only have to write collision code once with the enemy because it would know that anything that's tagged as a player weapon is something that it needs to run the damage effects on. So if we click on this tag here where it says untagged, we have a few default tags, so we at some point probably should go to the player tag and tag the player as player, but let's add one. And it takes us to this tags and layers list, and this is the list of custom tags. So click on the plus sign to add a new tag, and we're going to call this player, let's call them player projectile. And so anything that is tagged as a player projectile, we will know when we start writing the code for the asteroid to acknowledge the collision with this. So we'll hit save. And now, although I added the tag, it did not attach it to the laser. So I have to go back over to player laser and switch its tag from untagged to player projectile. And while I'm here, I might as well reset the transform as well. So now it's back at 0, 0, 0. So let's start trying to add the graphics to it. And so what I'm going to do with that is we'll add a game object, 3D object, and a quad. We're going to kind of, I guess, do some cheating in 3D. My weapon is just going to be a 2D sprite, but it's going to be so far zoomed out and have so many different special effects on it that I don't think players would be able to tell. So we're going to choose a quad. And let's see, can we see this quad? Oh, it's somewhere weird. So let's reset its transform. And we can see that right now the quad is kind of sitting as a vertical panel, and I don't really want that. So I am going to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. Another reason why I'm going to set it up like how I'm about to set it up, where I'm going to make this quad a child of this object, is that way I don't have to worry necessarily about the rotation of the graphics, because I'm only going to be worrying about this thing's z-axis is forward. Because if you notice, this graphic's z-axis is facing down, and so that would be kind of confusing to have to deal with. So let's make this a child of player image by dragging and dropping it. And now we can see that this quad is underneath player laser. And I'm going to also rename it to laser image. So we have this plain flat thingy. Now let's apply a material to it to actually start getting a graphic to it. So under the materials tab, we do have a few existing ones that might make a good laser. So FX bolt orange looks like a laser bolt. And so we can apply that to this panel and have it appear right there. And so far this is what my laser is going to be looking like. So from far enough distance, it's going to look perfectly fine. All right, and so we've got that set up. There's not a whole lot of settings I really need to change here. In fact, I'm probably not going to change any of these. So I think I'm done with the graphics, and we're going to go back to player image. And again, I just want to point out the advantage of setting it up the way I did. If we remember that the blue z-axis is forward, the forward axis of this quad is facing down, but the forward axis of the actual game object is aligned with the front of the laser, and that's what we want. So let's go through and start adding some components here to get it to do what we want. So first up, I do want a rigid body. So I'm going to go to Components, Physics, Rigid Body. And as of right now, the only thing that I really want to change, there's two things. I want to turn off Use Gravity, because again, for this whole project, we don't want things dropping through the y-axis. And also, I'm going to freeze the position of the y-axis. All right. Now, let's add a component, physics, capsule collider. A capsule collider is going to fit this to make it an ideal looking hitbox. Right now, the capsule collider looks like a sphere, but that's when we're done with it, it won't look like that. So the capsule collider, let's shrink the radius a little bit to 0.1, and we can see which direction it's actually starting to point in right now. So we can see that the capsule collider is going into the y-axis, and we need to get it going into the z-axis. So we can just switch the direction of the capsule collider to z-axis. And then we can shrink it a little bit. So we're going to need to set this height to be a little bit smaller. If I can find the height setting. Let's go with 0.7. That looks good. If you make this bigger, you will make the game a little bit easier, because it's going to be easier for you to hit asteroids. The smaller you make it, maybe the closer to the actual size of the sprite it will be. But a radius of 0.1 and a height of 0.7 looks good. And let's give it a light. I believe that is under rendering, light. And It's kind of orange-ish, so I want my light to be orange as well. So I'm going to choose it to be kind of a strong orange. I do want it to be a point light, and the range, I'm going to drop it to about 8. You might want to drop that more if you don't want it to be as far-reaching as it will be. But we won't really get a chance to see that until we actually have some asteroids to shoot at. And then the intensity, I'm going to go 1.5 because I want this to appear kind of bright as it goes past things. Right now, I'm not going to turn on any shadows, but we'll see if I want to do shadows in the future. Now, if we hit play, the laser actually does nothing, but it does sit there, and we can actually see the effects of the lighting on the player as we go around it. So we can kind of appreciate that the laser is probably going to work. It's just not moving at the moment. And so let's kind of throw together a quick script for this I wonder if that's going to continue being a problem there. Actually, I need to delete that. So on laser image, I do not want to have this mesh collider because I'm actually handling my collisions with the capsule collider here. And so let's go to mesh collider and delete that. Remove component. And then under player laser, let's switch it to being a trigger so that it's not treated as a solid object. It will be amusing though once we put an asteroid in if you turn off is trigger because the lasers will bounce everywhere. But for now, let's just turn that off. And so that error should go away. And we do have our shimmering laser there. And I did want to add code to kind of conclude this. So let's go to our scripts folder. And inside of player, I usually like to kind of keep all of my weapon scripts organized as well. So I'm going to create a new folder called weapons. And I'm going to right click that and go to create a C# script. And I'm going to call it laser underscore, let's just call it laser basic. Because if I was going to add other weapons, this is kind of the most primitive and basic of my lasers. I don't want to just call it laser because that's a little too general. And then we're going to double click that script. All right, so we've got some code to put in here. And we want to start with some just movement variables. So let's create a speed. And like I had said in previous videos, you could do the serialized field with a private instance variable here if you wanted to. But for now, I don't have a particularly strong reason to do that. I'm choosing to use integers for damage just to keep the math from getting overly messy. And so I'm choosing 10. Right now, 10 is a completely arbitrary number. I could have chose 1, but I'm choosing 10 because if I want to make a weapon that's stronger or weaker, I would rather not have to deal with decimals. So if I give like a big asteroid like 50 or 80 hit points, the math becomes a little bit more flexible if I'm working with 80 hit points instead of 8 hit points. Because the player will probably never see the difference between the two numerically, but it gives me more flexibility. And an option here for people who either hate screen wrapping or like screen wrapping. I found in the past that my classes tend to be pretty split on if they want lasers to screen wrap So we have the variable allow screen wrap, and that will allow my laser to wrap around the edge of the screen or not. And so we have an exist duration variable, which is going to track the length of how long the laser's been inside the level. And it is kind of a different, something you could think about is, would it be more interesting to track the distance traveled and have the laser delete after a certain distance, or track how many seconds it's been alive for? And, you know, there's not really a right or wrong way to do that. I do think it is a little bit harder to track the distance that it's traveled. But if you do distance traveled, then you could set things like, I want this laser to only have a max range of 600 units, as opposed to you having to do the math on this, where I know that if my speed is 10 and my exist duration is 1.5, that it could travel up to, at what, 15 Unity units? And so this exist timer is going to track how long it's been in existence for. And we're going to use the rigid body to move the laser. And so inside of the start method, we're going to first have to bind the rigid body to that variable. So we'll say laser equals get component rigid body. And that will attach the rigid body component to this variable laser so that I can actually issue commands. And we're going to just set a static speed. And we're going to do that by saying laser.velocity is set equal to transform.forward times speed. And so it's just going to take the forward vector, which is whatever the z-axis is pointing in, and then multiply it by my move speed. I will include a note here and say that rotation will be set by the player when spawned. So normally in some things I might be setting the rotation when I first create it, but I know that that's going to have to be a responsibility of the player when it spawns these when it spawns these lasers. Inside the update method, let's first start with if we allowed screen wrap to do a boundary check, boundary.checkBoundary, passing it this object. And so that was that static class that we wrote back, I think, in 2.5, and that will allow the laser to screen wrap if we checked the box for allow screen wrap. So people who want to see what that looks like can try it, and people who hate it don't have to use it. So we're going to increase the duration timer. We're just going to say exist timer plus equals time.delta time. This is actually, well, let me get to the next part, and then we can even print out how long the laser's been alive if we want to. So that way we can at least see that all of this working. So what's going to happen here is we're going to check to see if that exist timer that we've been adding time to has surpassed the exist duration. So it's going to every frame be adding to this, and if we're been alive too long, if we're past that exist duration, we are going to destroy the laser. So destroy is a pretty powerful command. It does delete it, and it just removes it. So all the scripts will stop, and it will no longer be inside the game world. I did say all the scripts will stop, but it will still finish running update. And so that is a dangerous thing to keep in mind. If you were to put this command up here, you would actually end up crashing, because if you delete the game object first and then attempt to check its position, it no longer has a position because you deleted the position. So you'd crash on this line because it doesn't have a position anymore, it doesn't exist. So you have to be careful with the destroy command. It needs to be the last thing that happens in a given method, because if something was going to continue happening after it, and it tries to reference part of the object that no longer exists, it would crash. You could still have code after destroy, but it just cannot do anything with the game object. It can't reference the transform, it can't reference a rigid body. It could still call other scripts that may exist in the game, but it cannot reference any other part of this game object because it has been deleted. And so let's see, the laser should move if we hit save. We shouldn't have any errors. And if we jump back to Unity, it takes a second to compile it, and we're going to attach the laser basic onto the player laser. And when we hit play, we can see that the laser moved, and we can even see that it's screen wrapped around. So if you don't like the screen wrapping, all you have to do is uncheck this allow screen wrap button, and when you do, the laser will just fly off the top edge of the screen. And so we're pretty close to being done with the laser. I can see that this debug is working. So let's jump over to the script real fast and turn off this debug command so we don't spam the console. Save our script. And let's turn this laser into a prefab, because we're going to be spawning it a whole bunch, and I need to be able to access that. So we'll take the player laser and drag and drop it down into the player prefabs. And so what we can see is that we're going to now have a player ship prefab that we haven't changed any recently, and a player laser prefab. Once you've done that, you can tell that you were successful because the player laser turns blue. That blue is a reference to the fact that it is now a prefab object. And so we would be safe to delete this from the hierarchy. Do not delete it from the project, though, because this is where we will spawn new ones from. But it is now safe to delete it here by pushing the delete key. And we're back to where we started, but now we have a player laser prefab that we can drop into the world wherever we need them. And so that's going to be the focus of the next video, where, oops, that's the player ship, where we're going to be firing off player lasers as an attack. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.